A good AI product is a product someone will actually think about and use on a regular basis. And I think a great AI product is one where I'm almost a little bit anxious when it's not around anymore, right? I don't really want systems that will try to do my job or do it better than me because I don't believe that can happen.
Hello, welcome to the devtools-fm podcast. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey, everyone. We're really excited to have Jason Liu on with us. So Jason, you're working as an independent consultant, really focused on AI. And this is a topic that we've touched on from a lot of different companies, but I'm excited to have someone who's like really focused in this space working on it. So before we dive in to sort of talk more about like what you're doing in the space and what you're working on, could you just tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm Jason. I spent the past, 8-9 years doing machine learning and have really transitioned through all the different kinds of modalities. Like in the beginning, it was very much like classical machine learning. Then it became computer vision and then later recommendation systems. And now as language models get really popular, I'm kind of applying everything I've learned in sort of deploying these systems, maybe in like 2015, 2016, 2017, but in this new like text modality versus doing things like images and recommendation systems. And really the biggest thing I've noticed is that a lot of the work that we've done with like agents or with RAG look very much like classical recommendation systems and classical like chatbot dynamics. And so it's been really fun to bring some of the old school work into this new paradigm.
Nice. That's awesome. It's interesting to think about how the industry has shifted a lot because it's like, not too long ago, we were just spending tons and tons of money on like NLP, just natural language processing, right? I was working for the company that owned Food Network, and we were doing a voice chat system for Amazon Alexa, and it was like templates. Like you write these like text templates to match these like loose phrases that people could say, and like people had to, say the exact incantation. And now it's like, with LLMs and things, we've got a lot more loose and how we can apply that. And it's just interesting how, just a little bit of extra research, well, I mean, not a little bit, but a lot of extra research has really shifted the dynamic and like how we approach and talk about these things.
Yeah, it's incredible. I feel like, 3 or 4 years ago, I was very dismissive of language model in general because I thought, okay, this is very hard. We're not going to make any progress. I had to go like do my real job, make some money, do computer vision. And when ChatGPT came out, I basically just like wrote a letter of apology to all of my friends who were doing NLP research. And I was like, hey, like, well, it works now. Let me go figure out how we can get some value out of this.
Cool. So with that in mind, let's set the stage a little bit. There's lots of new terms going around, and there's even new types of engineers going around. The new hotness is being an AI engineer. So what is an AI engineer exactly?
Yeah, I think in my mind, one of the biggest things that separate AI engineering from machine learning is that the machines are already intelligent, right? There's no more teaching that needs to happen. And so the tools you need to use to leverage the large language model is a little bit more different, right? I think, a great AI engineer is actually more capable of like doing more front-end development because now you're actually giving users an interface to these language models. But they still need to be much more quantitative when thinking about things like evaluations, how to test different language models, and also even have better like writing skills because we need to then go and figure out how to do prompt engineering, right? But if you think about the general task of prompt engineering, compared to something like data science, it has always been this translation mode. Right? In data science, I'm figuring out how do we take a business problem and turning it into some kind of like metrics and evaluations. In AI engineering, we take that same business metrics that we care about and then turn them into prompts. And so I think for the most part, it's very similar to maybe what data science looked like, in like 2015, 2016.
I've heard some like back and forth on the term prompt engineering online. Some people are like, hey, yeah, this is like a real field of discipline. Like it's not actually as easy as you might think it may be. And like it takes a lot of work. And then I've heard people be like very dismissive. This like reminds me of like, is CSS a programming language or not? And I don't want to like, bike shed too much, but sort of how do you think about it as a discipline and what are the big problems that people may see? And
so first of all, I definitely think it's real. The more I've worked on it, the more I'm convinced that it's real, but also embarrassed by how we actually get these things to work, right? There's a lot more magic that goes on. And so I think definitely in the years to come, prompt engineering will be much more developed, especially as models get smarter. What might happen is the average prompt can get much simpler. We can't just say, give me a summary. But as these models get smarter, the types of summaries, for example, that we want to get become much more detailed and nuanced. And you end up having to like bring in, experts to figure out what exactly you want to do, right? Just because you can ask for a summary doesn't mean the summary is useful or insightful in certain ways. And that kind of applies to almost every type of task in prompt engineering, right? If I gave it, a million contexts, like 30 pages of financial reports, a better prompt engineer, someone who can describe the outcomes they want, will get better results than just asking for a quick summary over, 200 pages of PDFs.
So there's really like I've gone into like trying to code up some of these things myself, and usually I'm just met with a lot of Python docs. So like what language do you think you should be coding in for this stuff? Does it matter, or like do you just need an interface to an LLM and you're off to the races?
I think for the most part, anything between TypeScript and Python makes a lot of sense. I think the only reason Python has an advantage right now is because the old machine learning community has already been in Python. And so in terms of what kind of tooling that exists by default, it's always been the case that something comes out in Python, they get some more traction, and then they slowly build out the JavaScript, the Ruby, the, whatever languages that are out there. But I think from a community perspective, everything really started from the Python world. Yeah, and also in terms of like JavaScript and TypeScript, because a lot of folks end up wanting to build tools that interface with customers and with the front end, I think there you have to make a decision of either having both a Python backend and some React front end, or being able to build that completely in React. I think there that really comes down to how much of the numerical quantitative side of things you want to interact with, right? You can have a website using JavaScript, but if you want to do evaluation and testing and use some of the libraries that do a lot more like agentic reasoning, they might not exist in JavaScript right now.
Yeah, that's been something that I've seen in my experience is like it's inconsistent of what exists. And you get a lot of people just like hacking things together, and they'll like do a lot of good research around like, oh, you're like I pull this like, chain of thought reasoning like React implementation or whatever, React, the like AI version of React, not like the UI version of React. And it's just like kind of the ecosystem is a little inconsistent, I think, especially in the TypeScript world. But I find another challenge on top of this is that you're always interfacing with some service provider. So it's like, obviously most people are going to be very familiar with OpenAI and their offerings, but like there's a lot of LLM platforms out there. There are a lot of, reasoning tools across the board, whether they be like vision or, voice or, and we have both, LLMs and then just like other generative artifacts or services. So how do you sort of stay abreast of the offerings that are out there? Like, how do you figure out like, oh yeah, these LLMs are good for these things? And then, do you think it's worthwhile to like try to get like a set of these services in your repertoire, or should you just like pick one and just like stick with it? Like, what's your advice?
Yeah.
There?
I think it definitely should start with the kind of problem you want to solve first, right? And so I think for someone who's tinkering, it makes a lot of sense to go try out, Opus, try out Grok, try out OpenAI. But when it actually comes down to building products that are solving business solutions, really you end up being limited by like, very fundamental things like rate limits and how much you can spend on a platform, right? Like half the time I'm just harassing my friends at OpenAI to give my customer like more credits to spend. In terms of what the landscape looks like right now, I think there's really three interesting players, right? Anthropic has those long context models like Haiku and Opus that are really good at writing. 4o with their new multimodal capabilities in the future, I think will really stand out among all the language providers. And then a third one that I think is really interesting is Grok, where you might have less rate limits and more rate limits, but just by being able to generate like 3,000, 30,000 tokens a second, the way that you build your product ends up being different just by using the token per second velocity. I think after that, playing around with open source and playing around with these other language providers makes a lot of sense. But in these production settings, it's really just I think between Opus, Anthropic, and OpenAI right now. And again, like it's more important that you understand what your business problem is, figure out how you can test which one is better, and just like run through the suite of tests rather than trying to like guess which one will perform better or worse.
So is Grok fundamentally different than the other ones? Because in my mind, it was just like a thing you could switch out for OpenAI and all the other things and had around the same properties.
Yeah, so they can host a bunch of different models like Llama 3 or Mistral,
Mhm.
but I think the unique property with Grok, uh, with the Q, is just how fast it is, right? When something is 10 times faster, like 30 times faster, you can build a different kind of application. Right? I think that is something that's very much like worth calling out as a different way of working with these systems.
We'd like to thank our sponsor for the week, Clerk. Clerk offers user management out of the box to make you build apps quicker. Nobody wants to stay focused on auth. They want to build their actual app. It doesn't matter if some people say it's as easy as adding a user to a table. Auth quickly grows out of hand. With so many different ways to implement auth, like multi-factor authentication, SSO, you might even need to implement one of those harder to do enterprise logins if you have an enterprise-based business. Or maybe you want to have a bunch of social logins. Setting those up takes time and can be complicated. Clerk handles all of that for you without any hassle. One cool thing I learned about Clerk this week is their never pay for a user's first day program. Might sound a little confusing at first, but let me explain. So say you just launched an app, it went on Hacker News and then blew up to the moon. Since Clerk has user-based pricing, you might think, oh, I'm going to pay for every single person that just happens to log into my app for a day, and then I'm going to have a huge bill at the end of the month. This program, what it does is if a user signs up, uses your app, only uses it for one day, and then leaves, you never actually pay for them because they're not really one of your customers. I really like this because it allows you to use the ease of Clerk while also not running up the bill if you happen to go viral. Super cool. If you want to learn more about Clerk, head over to clerk.com. Or you can go back to episode 75 where we interview one of the co-founders, Braden. Are you tired of hearing these ads? Become a member on one of the various channels that we offer it. And if you're not quite up for that, you can support us by buying some of our merch. Head over to shop.devtools.fm to see what we got. And with that, let's get back to the episode. So like a lot of these things are like providers right now. And I really think the future is like on device. Like I don't want to have to pay for every single thing I ask a thing. Like that is like usage-based pricing for something I might use in my personal life is not a fun thing. So do you think some of these models could come to the a local device in the future, or any of them are moving that direction, or is just like an LLM something that's just kind of too big in general to be run like maybe in like a browser?
Yeah, here it's really going to be around how specific you want these certain tasks, right? Like you can very much imagine like a language model that is just in your keyboard that can do better like text prediction, right? Or using a small language model to improve how Siri works. Um, I have some bigger opinions on like whether or not you can have a smaller model be able to reason more with a RAG that doesn't need to have the knowledge of the world. But I think everyone kind of recognizes that on device will ultimately be the way to go. And it's just a matter of how we can scale that and its capabilities in order to be actually useful, right? Because I think any language model of any size can probably run on your phone and help you do better like autocorrect and auto completion. But, you know, I don't know if like in the near future we're going to have a small model run on your phone that it is very like understanding of like medical records or legal documents. We might need some, offloading from that perspective.
Yeah, so I won't be generating code in my iMessage reply box.
Maybe some simple code.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about. So there's like, I suppose like two sides of this. So the sort of data that it takes to train the models, I'm sure there's like a certain like compression rate that you can't like beat. I'm sure that there's some theoretical maximum for that. So it's like, oh, you want to like stuff all the knowledge of the world in there, whereas probably going to be a ceiling to like how small that can actually be. And then, there's also like hardware improvements. It's like making it like dedicated hardware that's like really, really, really good at like either storing or evaluating these neural networks. It's all sort of interesting to think about. What do you think is the most important like area of unlock that we think maybe we'll hit in the next few years? Will it be like just continue to improve the models? Like, oh, now we have like GPT-5, or will it be like hardware, like better evaluation on like smaller machines? What do you think the big unlock for the next step is?
I think it comes from basically what you said about that compression rate, right? It's like, okay, if we want to compress all the world's knowledge, there is going to be some number of gigabytes this model has to be in order to have that. But I think the more interesting question is is that actually what we need? Right. So it seems to be the case that as these models get bigger and you give it the world's knowledge, it's able to reason and read and reply. But you can imagine a world where what if I take this compressed knowledge of the world and then subtract the world back out and try to only preserve the reasoning aspects, right? Then you could hypothesize that what if I just had a system with like longer context, doesn't have to know everything about the universe, but is able to, correctly take control of an iPhone. There's like, this might be a little bit more reasonable. It can just phrase a message, and if someone asks me a question, it can go search that by understanding that it can use a tool to do search and not have to necessarily remember, every single fact or every single like medical condition that they have, right? You can imagine training a model that is just able to reason, use tools, and read, but not necessarily remember that, every single thing in the encyclopedia.
There are a lot of different tools and a lot of different acronyms that come with being an AI engineer. There's RAG, there's LLMs, there's vector databases. Which one of these things do you think is like an actually important thing to learn? And what do you think is vaporware?
I would say right now, I have some opinions here, but I think for the most part, things like RAG and vector databases will definitely be needed, right? But only in conjunction with something like full text search, right? So if you look at how we test things, we have had text search for a very long time, and we've spent a lot of effort and a lot of money making text search really, really good. And as a result, I think we are already trained to understand something. Like if we wrote the document, we know how to retrieve it by writing a search query. With something like a vector database, it lets you be a little bit fuzzier and search things that are, tangentially related. I think if you combine the two, you get a pretty good search system that you can use for either RAG, right, which where we basically find documents, we give them to a language model, and the language model can read that out and then try to give you an answer, but also just for plain document search. I think in terms of vaporware, like this is a very spicy opinion, but I think things like knowledge graphs, for example, right? I think anything that's not SQL in the long run, it will probably look like vaporware. But that's I think a pretty hot take.
SQL's a safe bet, I think, in general. But it is an interesting like parallel between like how do you take concrete data structures that are stored in some uniform way in a relational database or whatever, versus the more fuzzy, sometimes fake world of LLMs where you have like relative knowledge that's sort of accumulated over in a neural network that's because it's processed a lot of information, and like connecting the bridge between those is interesting. I do wonder what the world will look like in a few years, and especially if we can make more progress on correctness, which seems like a big thing. So maybe this is a good next question is like, how do you think about the hallucination issue with LLMs? And is like, is there a world in which we're able to wrangle this a little bit more, like get closer to like a correctness threshold or something?
Yeah, I think the way that we'll sort of try to avoid this is by two things, right? I think one, language models try very hard to make the reader happy, and so it will try to lie to satisfy the user. So I think one part will just be making sure that we can like downsample that kind of behavior and be more comfortable with saying like, no, I don't understand. The second thing again really goes down to this idea that like, because it has knowledge of the world and it tries to be helpful at all costs, it might make things up. But if we train models that have less knowledge and more reasoning, it might get us to a place where we can only give the data that we wanted to look at, and it will try to reference and cite as much of it as possible to make sure that things are a little bit more grounded. And in practice, when we do these like fine-tuning tasks where, if I have a question, it will make a list of sentences and a list of citations. And then if we fine-tune it in a way where we say, okay, if every citation must validate the statement that you're going to make, we do find better, hallucination reduction rates, right? But this is only because our hallucination task is very specific. It might just be, I don't want you to write URLs that don't exist, right? That's a very concrete, measurable way of saying like yes or no, something is correct. But in the more general case, it's hard to figure out what does it actually mean to have a hallucination, and is it always a bug versus a feature at times. But I think ultimately that might just come down to having different kind of models with different requirements on, again, like how happy do you want to make the user versus how much knowledge do you have, and versus how much do you want to cite and be able to say no to things.
Yeah, it's an interesting property of LLMs where sometimes I have to go, you're wrong, stop lying. And they're like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, So it seems like a hard problem to solve, but like I think one of your points there that we'll be able to like factor out the reasoning, like that seems like kind of a spicy point in itself. Just like is there reasoning to this things? Because like the way I've come to think about it, like at first I was like, oh, maybe there is some reasoning, but in my mind now, it's like LLMs are mostly just like, let's predict the next word that's most likely and it's right most of the time. So do you actually think we can like factor reasoning out?
I think so. Like we have models that can like, play chess. We have models that can play Go. We have models that can like beat Dota and win at poker. There's definitely some reasoning aspect, right? But I definitely also think that like all this world knowledge is kind of just because we haven't solved reasoning reasonably well. Like we don't have the data for reasoning, but we just have data about all of humanity. Um, so yeah, I definitely think there is a future where if we can figure out how to remove the knowledge part, we could still have a system that says, hey, like I don't really know what kind of libraries exist, but if you give me the documentation for these libraries, I will now write more correct code because I'm never going to like hallucinate a library that doesn't exist in order to generate code for you.
Yeah, it would be so useful because like when I'm using GPT, it like in my code base, it like sometimes we have a very complicated model package, like not an LLM model, like a data model package in our repo, and it loves to come up with like just the perfect function, and you're like, that's what I want, and then you go look and oh, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's like from library import solve my problem, and then I just like
Yeah.
exactly. And there's now a bunch of like open source issues of just users who had hallucinated methods in someone's library, and the maintainers are just like, hey, what the hell, guys? This doesn't even exist. Did you even check the code?
That is a fascinating problem, though. This like the second order effects of hallucination, of like people taking it seriously and trying to do things or like submitting things as answers, or like unfortunate like misuses of like maybe if you have like a doctor or a lawyer or like someone whose opinion really matters, a civil engineer, like you want them to be correct, and if they get lazy and use an LLM, that's fraught.
Yeah, I think there it's going to be a lot around how do we build UIs that allow humans to evaluate the correctness of systems, right? Like if the AI system is generating a legal statement, if we ask the human to read the entire legal statement, that might be a very difficult task. But if we can create pairs of just, like examples to show someone, evaluating maybe like 3 or 4 sentences at a time and referencing some source material, that might be a task that takes, 30 seconds per label. Whereas reading the entire contract might just be like much, much harder. So I think there's going to be a lot more research in figuring out what is the best way of getting feedback from experts that we can use to then, maybe fine tune the model to be better or generally change the way people will have to work, right? Maybe in the future, there's only like code reviewers, there's no code developers. And, that could be interesting, but, does that mean we're going to be shown multiple versions of a PR and told which one is correct? Or are we going to be evaluating like, is their only job to be building like unit tests? Unsure, but there might be a different way of interacting with how we build things and how we generate data.
Kind of speaking of like how we build things, I wanted to ask you a little bit more of a like, I guess, an industry specific question. Uh, it definitely seems like the tech industry does tend to go through fads. So we'll have like hype cycles. We had like Web3 and the pandemic was like a big hype cycle. And now we have like, obviously AI is a huge hype cycle. And we see a lot of companies that are just like sprinkling on, LLMs into their products. It's like, oh, we are now the blah, blah, blah for AI, or like the AI for blah, blah, blah. I'm curious about how you think about that, especially as you're looking for companies to engage in work opportunities with. I'm sure you have to have some level of filter, like, does this actually make sense for their business use case? And you sort of reference this a few times. So how do you sort through like valuable usages versus like marketing speak in the AI world?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is a good AI product is a product someone will actually think about and use on a regular basis. And I think a great AI product is one where I'm almost a little bit anxious when it's not around anymore, right? And there's really 2 reasons. I really like AI products that do like blunder minimization. So like, I don't really want systems that will try to do my job or do it better than me because I don't believe that can happen. But I can know for certain that when I have this like AI copilot around that there are going to be less mistakes. Like, that's a very simple example. You know, a product that could make you a little bit more anxious is like, I am pretty like dependent on my like a good AI note taking app now, right? With things like Limitless and with Circleback, if I'm doing a job interview or I am meeting with an investor and I don't have the notes, I think like, oh, like let me go invite this just in case because I might miss something or I might do something else, right? And this is because again, like in every meeting, I'm so used to it just providing this like blunder minimization that I feel very good about using these products. The second thing is going to be around, you know, who are you actually selling to? Like, are you selling to a consumer? Are you selling to someone who is just trying to save time versus selling to someone who is using the outputs of these AI systems to make better decisions, right? I always tell my friends, like, if you sell to someone who's trying to save time, they may be willing to spend like $100 like a year tops. But if you sell to someone who's trying to make decisions, right? Like if you sell to an investor and by using AI, they can do research faster, right? Again, minimizing the mistakes means that I can, you know, maybe like source more deals, but ultimately make better decisions. And so like those two, I think are the biggest ones. Like something to be memorable, something that makes you a little bit anxious once it like leaves your life, and have something that helps you make better decisions and minimize mistakes rather than just saving time. Because I think the saving time is kind of the trap right now, which is like you got to assume their time is valuable and they even value their time.
Yeah. I've seen some interesting takes on this. So like Linear had came out with a product feature very specifically for, you know, a particular area of their product. And they were talking about, you know, they're very opinionated on how they do product design and kind of the best of ways. And they're like, you know, you can use AI as an enhancement for a feature, but it shouldn't be like the sole purpose. It's like a means to an end. And I thought that they sort of handled it well. And it's just interesting to see how people position themselves. I've seen some companies that like market themselves as AI, and you're like, I have no idea how that even like makes any sense at all. Like what are you using? Like and then, you know, obviously there are some that are just like chat GPT wrappers. They're like, oh, we'll just like put a UI on front of OpenAI and, you know, build another thing. So it's interesting to see the gamut of like how people are experimenting with this and where they're going. But I think we still have a lot to learn as an industry, for sure.
Yeah. But even there, I think a lot of it ends up being like, where's the value actually being derived? Like my favorite example around GPT wrappers is actually job boards, right? Like there's a ton of job boards making a ton of money, but it's really just a wrapper over like a MySQL database, right? Like what you're actually selling is just rows in a database with like, you know, some link to a checkout page. But because of the way you package it and because of the way you know, prepared it, it's very cheap to, you know, pay $300 for a job listing because a recruiter takes 10% of their salary, right? So again, because you're selling to the decision makers, it's really easy to capture that value, right? You wouldn't think to yourself, okay, well, the database costs me $10 a month, so I should only be charging like 10 cents per job listing, right? I think it's the same thing in the AI world where we should be pricing on that value rather than just saying like, we will save some time, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I like the way you put it of like the anxiety. Like if I think to all of the tools that I like to use that like have AI involved, like if you took them away from me, yes, I'd be very anxious because like they provide a lot of value to me.
Yeah, like now when I code, I will actually like type something and then pause and then wait for the next completion to happen. And if the completion is slow, I go, oh, like, was I unclear? What did I do wrong? Right. And I think you can tell when that is the case.
Yeah, I definitely have that same thing where it's like, oh no, they're not showing up. I like feel the dread of having to type so much more.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a lot of people building a lot of things with LLMs, but what do you think most people get wrong when they start integrating LLMs into their product? This kind of ties into what we were just talking about.
I think the simplest thing, which I think, you know, almost every person I've spoken to always has like made this mistake, is thinking about things like fine tuning a little bit too early, and in particular using the cheapest models first, right? I think what you should be doing is not using the most expensive model you can find to figure out if it's even possible at all. And once you prove out these concepts, you know, reduce cost if it actually makes sense to reduce cost, right? You know, it takes maybe a couple of cents to call OpenAI, and maybe if you have enough users, that's going to cost a bunch of money. But if you start doing things like fine tuning, now you have to hire like a machine learning engineer. Now you're worrying about like where do you get your GPUs? You know, it ends up being kind of a nightmare. And so I had this tweet that went like pretty popular like a couple of weeks ago that was just like, hey, like if you're worried about your LLM costs, I don't think your product is like that valuable, and you should just charge more. Like instead of trying to figure out how to like save 2 cents on the dollar, solve a really valuable problem instead. And so yeah, I think the biggest mistake is around trying to use these open models and trying to use fine tuning when you should really be trying to build a product and use the best models you have access to, and that just might be like 4.0 or Opus. Yeah.
It seems odd to me that people like there isn't a nice UI web solution where I can go fine tune models like super easily. Because like I did some explorations with like image generation, and I did my own LoRa on top of Stable Diffusion that like kind of encoded a certain anime style into it. And I was actually really surprised at how easy the process was. It was just like hidden in a Google Colab notebook, and I had to like put things in Google Cloud, and it just felt so like janky to me, and was like, this is an easy process, but it's like there's layers of this like FUD of like, oh, it's a hard thing to do and you have to set a lot of things up. So do you think, are there any startups like that, or do you think there's like room for one?
I mean, there's like OpenAI does it. I think Together and Anyscale also does fine-tune models. But I think the difference between, again, it's like it's the same as getting a summary and getting a good summary that people would pay for is very different. And so if you think about these examples of like generating images, like generate cartoons, very very straightforward. But I have a friend who uses like generative AI to generate fake images of MRIs with tumors in them, and they use that to augment their models to be able to better detect tumors, right? That ends up being a very specific problem of understanding like, what are the right knobs I need to figure out to actually build images that can improve my model, right? And that just ends up being like data preparation and model training, and less about just like, did I have a folder of 30 pictures that I can just throw into some UI? And I think that's the same thing with fine tuning. It's really easy to fine tune a model, but it's really hard to figure out if that actually has resulted in a better business outcome.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's it seems like there's a lot of things to keep in mind when you're trying to add something like this to your product. So what do you think are the hardest parts of bringing like some AI solution to production?
I think bringing something into production is actually quite simple now because it's all really APIs. The harder part is when you go viral and the product doesn't work or you lose faith in it because it's hallucinating. How do you then debug how to improve these systems, right? I think software engineers really feel like if you have it in production and you've deployed it, it means it worked, right? But really you get in this place where actually when you deploy it, it's like 80%. The 80% doesn't even mean that you shouldn't have deployed. It's just where you're at. And then going from 80 and actually being able to figure out what that number means and how you improve that metric, I think that's mainly the hard part. And that's where I think like most of my advisory work has been is actually after the deployment. It's like, hey, Jason, like we've deployed the system, we went viral, we have a bunch of users, but now we're losing 20% of our users every month because it's not citing things correctly, or it's not able to actually, generate summaries that are useful for people, right? Like people are passing in 3-hour lectures hoping to get, study notes, and we get 7 sentences that say like this video is a professor talking about the importance of mathematics in the workplace. You know what I mean? Like, and figuring how to actually quantify that, those end up being the harder problems.
This is funny because this is very topical with like Google giving search recommendations for like, oh, you should eat rocks for your health or whatever. It's just like AI generated bullcrap, right?
But it's like, how would you convert that into like any number or any binary thing that you could say, select star from data where like label greater than 0.5, give me all the bad examples, let's fix that. They can't do it, right? And so it's really hard to actually go figure out like, how do you debug that whole process?
So what is the strategy that you suggest to these companies? Because like testing seems like a hard problem where it's like in traditional testing, it's like I have inputs, there are outputs. They should always be this. In most prompts, it's like how do you determine good? Like here at Descript, we have, I think there's like 1 or 2 workflows that we have like tests for where we can be like, oh, this got better, this got worse. But that doesn't seem like it's the case for most problems.
Yeah, I mean, my solution to this is very much from like my social networks background. Like you should just launch the product. Like if Google, for example, I think they should have like launched the product in a much smaller English speaking population that was not the US. Like just launch in New Zealand, run it for like 3 or 4 weeks, have really important like feedback mechanisms, collect that feedback, and then figure out what's going on. But even then, at like Facebook, for example, when we did that, it would still be the case that if you were able to get a New Zealand and Australia to run these tests, when you then deploy to the US, the Americans are still just like super unhinged, and it's still hard to red team what exactly like the US population will use with these language models. Um, but I think that majority is like very much unsolved, and I think that's why they took so long to deploy. And even when they did take so long, they still messed up. So part of me really feels like at this point you should just deploy earlier, mess up quicker, and then just sort of make sure that the team is in place to iterate quickly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. There's been a theme that has happened over that we've covered over the last several episodes, and I think the most prominent like start of this was when we talked to Danny Grant, Jam Dev, talking about like how we just have a higher quality bar for software products these days.
Yeah.
This is like, in the say like 2010s area, it was like MVP. If you're not embarrassed of it, you ship too late, just like get it out, get it in front of people. And that seems to be, kind of to your point. We're seeing that more and more with the AI space. And my hypothesis on that was largely because everything is moving so fast that people feel like we're going to get left behind if we just try to make this thing perfect. But there is this tension of like people expect more from their software. They expect it to be more correct, more beautiful, more capable, like whatever else, and have like less patience for it. So do you think that I don't know, people are going to be fundamentally more patient with like LLM generated things, or like, do you think that this will be an issue? I'm just kind of curious to like contrast these areas.
I think it comes down again to sort of selling to the wrong audience, right? It's like if we sell to these consumers for these like $15 or like $5 a month apps, you end up just getting kind of like the cheapest, least patient person that wants to like try something to convince themselves they want to save their time. Whereas I find that when you actually sell to like, bigger, like for example, when we sell to things like executive coaches and do like, call summaries or consultants, we don't ever run into the patience problem because they just have other things they need to get done, and this is something that they're using to like unlock their productivity. Whereas like, I think when these higher price point customers end up having issues is around things like quality, right? The consultant can say, hey, I made 15 phone calls. I know 3 or 4 people had to answer to this question and you only pulled out 2 of them, right? Something is wrong. I don't trust the system anymore. I think that's when you can then go back in and because you build a very specific product, you can go focus on that and improve it and measure it. Whereas again, when you try to capture everybody, it's really unclear what anybody really wants. And as soon as you do any kind of improvements in the system, you take it for granted basically the next day, right? It's like day 1 and you get like Wi-Fi on the plane. Day 2, you feel like it's too slow, right? I think that's generally how, the average consumer feels.
Yeah, that echoes a sentiment we heard from the creator of NPM, Isaac. He was like, I'd rather sell to one person with a lot of money than 10,000 people with not very much money. It's a lot easier to keep that one person happy than it is to keep 10,000 people happy.
Yeah, I mean, because I think patience is about having other things to do, and only busy people have other things to do. And so these other busy people, they understand that like, time is money, money is time, and they can sort of make those trade-offs and recognize what they're getting out of it, right? Like it is companies and managers that can recognize, okay, a junior engineer is going to be cheaper, but I'm going to have to delegate more. A senior engineer is going to be much more expensive, but I can kind of tell them what I want, and I know that a couple weeks from now, things are going to be okay, right? And I think like the consumer base hasn't really grasped that fact yet as they're trying out different models.
So you've mentioned a few cool projects. That meeting note thing that you mentioned, I'm definitely going to check out after this episode. Seems super useful. But what are some other cool non-chat related products/projects that you've found really cool that use LLMs?
I think the biggest one would be Cursor. I don't know if you guys have tried it out, but I think the way that they've built out a experience that is better than Copilot because they have this like next action prediction has been like very ergonomic. So the idea is that you can just select code, press Command K, and then give instructions give instructions, and it can figure out what in the context you need to use to generate better outputs. And so, I will go into 4.0 to write some code. I'll then enter Opus and help me take that code and turn it into a blog post, right? And then because you can do this very interesting like at command, as you're giving these commands, I can add external documentation, I can add other files, and really have a really very natural way of writing code now, right? I have, for example, my own library's documentation in Cursor. So when I ask it to write better documentation or more documentation, I'll do something that's like at this file.py, write it just like the docs of at instructor.py, right? And that just feels very, very natural. And again, once I don't have that, I get that little bit of anxiety that I think is really important for these language models.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that like it it is interesting in the way that we're developing new habits around these like tools. I read a thing about like the millennial pause. It's like this reaction where when you're starting to when like millennials are starting to record themselves, they like pause for a few seconds before the recording starts. Whereas like Gen Z just like goes straight into it or something. So it's like I wonder what are LLMs going to do to us in this way, right? What ticks are we going to develop?
I mean, with coding now, I basically have that pause. Right? Like when I go on my friend's computer and I type something, I'll like start the name, and I kind of already know what the autocomplete would have given me, but on a different computer, I just look like I'm extra slow. Even the way that I write now, like a lot of my coding is actually using speech to text. So I both use speech to text and cursor at the same time, and I'm kind of just very comfortable now with like selecting code, talking a little bit, selecting code, talking a little bit, and now I definitely can't do that in Vim or on my friend's computer.
Sure.
If I ever had to like show them something.
Yeah, dictation and LLMs go together very well because it's like sometimes when you're writing these prompts, you're like, I could just code this in less characters. It might take me less keystrokes to do it in the end, but actually talking to my editor seems like a really nice workflow.
It's been I've been using it for a year now. It's pretty good.
So we have like iPad babies, who just like come up like with touchscreens. Now I'm wondering what are LLM babies going to be like? They just like want to talk to every computer.
I think it's going to be great because LLMs require you to, at least right now, require you to be very specific and intentional in how you describe the requirements of the problems you want to solve. And I definitely think using an LLM has made me like a better manager of junior engineers, and being a manager of junior engineers has made me a better prompt engineer, right? Because now you can't really just say like, "Oh, solve this problem for me." I have to go, no, solve this problem for me. This is when you would know. This is when you know you'll be successful. Consider these three qualities as you build the system. Make sure that like this piece of code needs to be very well organized because this is going to be something to be open source. But for this piece, just do it as quickly as possible. And then you have to reason about whether like you want to use Opus or 4.0. I think there is a bit of a skill and delegation that people are developing because of language models.
Yeah, that's really fun to think about. So let's transition over and talk about some of the work that you've done. So you have some open source tools that you've been working on. One is called Instructor. What is Instructor and what does that help you with?
Yeah. So Instructor is basically types for LLMs. Right now, when you post to an API call, you make a request, you send it some list of strings, and you get a string back out. And if you want something that's structured, you kind of hope that it's structured. Maybe you're doing some regular expression to parse out some JSON object. Then you JSON loads and you hope all the keys and values are in there. And, generally what you do is you might use Zod in JavaScript, or you might use Pydantic in Python to validate that object. And then once you have that validation and you have that guarantee, then you're in a place where you kind of have a type that you can work with. And that boundary between the API call to the language model and the rest of your system is going to be safe, right? And one of the things we do with that validation is if anything fails validation, we have some prompts that can go and re-ask the language model and say, hey, you had these errors, the date was not formatted correctly, the phone numbers are not formatted correctly. Also, this response doesn't pass some like content moderation rules, regenerate the answer. And so in production settings, you have type safety at runtime. And then because you might want to fine-tune models later, you can then fine-tune models that say, okay, given the input and these two attempts at getting the right answer, now I want you to give me the answer in a single attempt. And so for these very specific like Unix-like type boundaries, you can then fine tune very small task specific models to do these jobs.
Yeah, it's really cool. It reminds me of a library from Microsoft called TypeChat. I think that some of the TypeScript team was responsible for building that.
So how it works is like it'll get wrong stuff back sometimes and just like reprompt the thing over and over again.
Yeah, so I mean, these language models are pretty good now that like if you can do it in one attempt, it'll usually just work. It's like 0 or 1. Yeah, they're basically smart enough that you can basically capture any kind of validation error as if it was a regular error. Like the way that you implement this is no different than how you would just implement a form, right? So in the same shape of code that has, you register a validator that attaches to some attribute and you say, okay, well, password 1 and password 2 has to match and there must, you match some regex. You can do that and it basically captures the exception messages and passes them back to the language model. But what this means is you can just build more sophisticated validators. And so today it might just be, the list must be greater than 10 items. But tomorrow it might be the joke must be funny and reference an animal, right? Because you just might put LLMs in that loop again.
That's really cool. I mean, I think this is like this kind of tooling is like more of what we need for the correctness, right? Just like having more confidence that it is doing the things that we want it to do. And especially because if you're feeding it back into some other process in some other system, then it like, you want to make sure that that is at least correct. So that's cool.
Yeah, like in the like linear case, for example, it might make sense to say, okay, given this call transcript, give me the action items as this like big markdown file, but that might not be like consistently useful. Whereas if you could generate just the task list that matches the schema of the API call you want to make to linear, and then also assign all these dependencies, now you can have the structure that is not just a linear ticket, but it could be an entire project based on that call, right? And because you're working with the data structures and because you have this type safety, the code you write ends up being much nicer, right? If you just ask for JSON, you still have to like parse it and then hope every attribute is correct, and you still have to make sure that if one ID depends on another ID, that it's assigned correctly. But the validation kind of captures all of that for you.
So does it just work on like the output end or like the input end also? So if I'm asking something and does it like kind of load into context? Like it should kind of look like this. And then when it gets it out, it validates that it kind of looks like that.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different implementations of how other language models can do this structured output. Sometimes we do something like constrained sampling, where because we know the shape, we can basically say like, given this current state, I know you're not allowed to generate any of these tokens, only generate tokens that are valid. And so, JSON load, for example, allows you to do that. But in other tools, in other systems, they have something called tool calling, which again, you pass in a JSON schema and you get returned an instance of that JSON class, right? But JSON isn't necessarily enough. And so that's where the validations come in to take you to that final step of correctness rather than just structured output.
Nice. That's really cool.
So right now we discussed there's lots of different tools around these things, but as language models get better, do you think we'll need like less of these tools? Like in a future where language models are better, do we have to be not as good at prompt engineering? Does that discipline just kind of disappear if the model's good enough?
Yeah, so this is really two things, right? I do think that as the language models get better, we're going to need less tools. This is because right now you need to have the model like generate an answer, reflect on its own answer, correct it, then try again. And so I think definitely that will become simpler. And in the same sense, prompt engineering will be simpler because it's able to reason a lot more about how you do things. Like today, to do a good summary, you might have to say like you are an expert, executive that's reading these notes, generate a meeting summary that is like actionable and has like good references to who is accountable for what things based off of this framework that our company uses to like do meeting minutes, return that in Markdown. In the future, you might just say like, this is for me, I am an executive, right? You can definitely believe that. But on the same token, just because things get easier doesn't mean we do less work. It's often the case that as things get cheaper, we have more demands of the system. A simple example is like the battery on your phone. The battery has been increasing in capacity over the past 10 years, but the battery life has not because we just keep building more complicated applications. And so I think that's where the trade-offs will be. I think the simple cases will get simpler, but this will allow us to actually do much more sophisticated things in the future, right? Today, we need to use an agent to write an email. Maybe tomorrow the email is done in one shot, but like biology research still needs to have like an agent in the loop, right? So I think that's kind of where we'll meet as language models get smarter.
That's cool. So if you could make one priority decision for all the LLM providers, is like this feature, I want you all to implement it, what would it be?
This is very biased because my answer is structured outputs, right? And the reason is because I think even if these systems get smarter, the pain really is on like the processing layer, right? Like there's a reason we don't send things as like untyped JSON. There's a reason we're not sending CSV files over the internet, right? We have serialization formats, we have protobufs because they are more efficient in certain ways and they're safer in certain ways. And I think as we, take the code that we write with language models more seriously, they're going to have a lot more requirements on the safety of these models in terms of just, again, like how many runtime errors are we going to have? And this is one of these things that will last no matter how smart these models are. Like today we'll want structured because we just want to write code that's not crazy. Like if someone made an API endpoint and the return type was just string, like I would be livid. Like I would never use that endpoint, right? I would hope there was like some kind of like open API spec. I'm hoping there's some example JSON that I can look at. And it's because it makes me feel better about consuming from these endpoints. And so being able to specify these return types in a much more opinionated way, I think is going to be a really big step in just making the adoption of language models for systems higher, right? Because for chatbots, it makes sense. I send a message in, I send a message out. And now they're struggling with multimodal because they've realized like, okay, with the text message, I can attach a picture, I can attach multiple pictures, multiple captions. It could be a voice memo. And so they're trying to solve that aspect. But when it comes to systems, I kind of want like a protobuf to send between systems.
Cool. With that, let's move on to tooltips. So my first tooltip of the week is a project that I already shared, but it got better. So I'm going to share it again. v0.dev is a way to generate UI just from a prompt. It does really well. You can iterate on things, but the update I really wanted to share here, which I think is an interesting move for Vercel, is that it's now build is generate UI with shadcn/UI, which I think is just a great story. Just like some kid made a thing that everybody started using. Now he works at Vercel. Now it's like the thing behind one of their new initiatives. So what shadcn UI is just a way to generate components into your code base. And now you can combine them. And so stuff you generate from V0 will actually be kind of like somewhat usable code that you can plop down into your React app and it'll just work. And assuming that you have all the shadcn UI components installed, you can even customize what the output will be. So like the stuff you're seeing in the app now is not really what you might see when you put it in your app. You're just kind of seeing the structure that it produces instead, which I think is a big step. The next step I want to see, of course, is not just shadcn. I want to see this for my design system so that like engineers at my company could come in and generate UI with our design system. I think that would be pretty cool.
I do think it makes a lot of sense to like elevate the level of abstraction that it's generating at, because there's like a lot of details when you're thinking about UI. It's just like, oh, accessibility. And like, I mean, there's just a lot of fine grained details that's going to be really hard to generate correctly. So like going up an abstraction layer, let's just have like a solid base that we know is like good. But yeah, more support for more frameworks would be interesting.
Yeah.
You just got to go reach out to Vercel and their white glove service. And we'll have tried just to implement the Descript design framework.
Yeah, at a low price of probably way too much money. Okay, next up we have LLM client.
Yeah, so this is a fun one that I found recently. It's a TypeScript library. Well, I'll come back to that in a second. But it like implements a lot of different things. So it's got like RAG, it's got React, not React the UI, again, React the AI fixture, chain of thought, function calling. It works over like different providers. It's got like a relatively like simple AI, and it also has like open telemetry integration if you want to like do tracing for it. So Andrew, if you scroll down, you can kind of see it'll like give some interesting things. So there was something that I didn't know. It's like part of how this is structured is a there's like some research out of Stanford or something about this like pretty simple syntax of like describing like questions and responses and types like very tersely in a prompt. It reminds me, Andrew, a little bit of pseudolang we talked about a while back. So it got some of that feel to it. Anyway, it does a lot of stuff, and it's kind of interesting. I'm using it right now to experiment on building a CLI agent just to be able to like describe, hey, I want you to take action, like do these things. Tell me when this file was created, and have it like give me a list of CLI commands to run to be able to like do that. You could do that all with just like OpenAI's API if you wanted to do that. But anyway, it's kind of interesting to explore this library. If anybody is wanting to do some open source contributions, the TypeScript types on this could be greatly improved. There's some weird build stuff under the hood here. So that's the only caveat for that, but it's been pretty cool.
Cool. Next up, we have the combination of Cursor, which they got a nice new pretty website. I haven't seen this one yet, and better dictation.
Yeah, so like I mean, if anyone follows me on Twitter, they kind of know that like I've been sort of fighting this like hand injury for the past like 2.5 years. So it's one of the reasons I don't code as much as I used to. And two of the tools I really use in combination a lot is better dictation, that basically uses a on-device language model. So it basically uses like on-device fast English whisper to dictation, and then I use Cursor to then edit all my code. And so a very simple pattern I do is basically I'll select code, Command K, Command L, 2 letters right beside it, and then I'm able to, using my voice, generate some code. Anyways, this is like a tool that like my friend had built for me, and then we ended up building it out. And so if anyone wants to try it out, you can use Jason20 to get it for $20. And yeah, all it does is it just loads the Hugging Face model locally on your computer, and yeah, you get access for life. And so if you use this with Olama, you can actually code on a plane, and that is a crazy feeling that blew my mind at one time when I tried it out.
Yeah, I've been trying to use like I kind of got inspired by another coder. Who's the guy? And Justin, we interviewed him. Scott Hanselman.
Yeah.
Scott Hanselman is also very much in the like dictate to code. And then I got home and tried to start dictating with Max dictation. Oh my God. How have they not made it better yet? It's crazy.
I was using the Mac dictation for about 1.5 years, and it completely changed the way that I spoke, because I would have to enunciate every single word in order for it to do well. But Whisper, obviously, it's a lot faster, but it has its own funny behavior.
I don't mean this to be my tooltip, but there's this other project that I've had my eye on, which should be easy to remember. It's called Cursorless. So it's cursorless.org, and it's specifically for coding with your voice. Yeah, they do a lot of really interesting stuff around like providing like little visual indicators directly in your IDE to like help you jump to different points. So if you like need to move your cursor around, it's a really fascinating project. When I was at Recurse Center, I was doing a little bit of research on we're just like doing a thought experiment. It's like what would happen if you tried to build a language for someone who is blind, like just build a language for someone who's blind. And that's like a hard thought experiment. And then like I came to a conference and I actually saw Cursorless. And I mean, obviously you have to be sighted to be able to use this, but for people with like hand injuries and stuff, I was like, I think this is pretty interesting.
Yeah, like at some point, the company I worked for almost suggested I get a typist so I could keep coding, and I realized that coding is not just like the coding was not just like editing a single file. Like the thing that ended up driving me crazy was like transitioning through large code bases, right? Yeah. Like if there was an on-call, like it's not one file that has like one typo. It's like okay, like look at the error message. Can you on line 172? Can you jump to that file? Okay, can you just double? Okay, what's that function name called? Okay, and then can you go back to the original? It gets crazy, right? And so that's why I think Cursor has like the magic of all the prompts inside, and so it's able to do that. But this is cool. Very cool. I'm definitely gonna check it out. Cursorless.
Okay, so a coworker shared this morning on Slack, and it is amazing. So this is a CLI library to just do crazy text stuff and I have no clue how they're doing it. Like some of the examples they do, I can't even imagine a terminal like rendering that. So like if you just go through these, there's like a bunch of like matrixy looking ones. There's one where this becomes like a circle out of a galaxy. There's one where all the text on the screen turns into fire. There's just so many cool things that they've done with this library. And I really want to see some terminals integrated because this seems like the most polished terminal thing I've ever seen. Like, sure, like there's a library where you can generate these like text image type things that some people use, but those pale in comparison to what they're doing on this project. So if you ever wanted to make a very pretty CLI with Python, go check out what's it called? Effects, just terminal text effect. Yeah. I highly suggest you go look at the website in the show notes because it's a fun scroll through.
Yes.
Next up, we have Chidori.
Yeah. So this is Chidori is a framework by this guy named Colton who I'd met through a mutual friend. And it's an agent framework for LLMs, essentially. So there's a lot of problems in building agent flows. And one of the things you think of is like, say you have this like chain of thought, this reasoning, and you have like multiple steps that it has to go down. If it gets to the wrong path or to the wrong conclusion, a lot of times you just have to like restart. It's like, okay, sorry, that didn't go well. Let's like tweak the original thing and go through all this reasoning again. The really interesting thing about Chidori is it does time travel debugging kind of, but you can like reset to a different point and say, actually, I want to step back a few steps and then retry from this point. So Colton's working on this startup called Thousand Birds. It's like thousandbirds.ai. And then I think Chidori is like a part of this larger ecosystem that he's building out, but it's got a lot of really cool stuff in it. It honestly reminds me a lot of the startup that I'm working on, Membrane. There are like some parallels and the kinds of work that we're doing, but because this is like really focused on agents and LLMs, I thought it was an interesting thing to share for this one.
This reminds me of last episode a little bit because like Dagger almost, I see what he was saying about LLMs and Dagger working really well together, where you could create these big workflows that are basically all cached based on the inputs and outputs.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Last up, we have OneSec.
I mean, if anyone who follows me on Twitter knows, I post a ton, and that is despite using OneSec. Basically, what OneSec does is it just makes you take like a deep breath before you open any apps, and it really helps manage a lot of distractions when I'm building things. And so I have it set to like every time I open up Twitter, the next time I open up Twitter, it takes like 0.1 seconds longer to open up the app, and it's pretty funny, but it actually makes a meaningful difference in my productivity.
Yeah, I'm a fan.
Oh yeah, you use them?
Yeah.
So you use this and were able to post that many times on Twitter in the last year?
I just use a laptop.
Oh, you just use your laptop. There you go. Can get around any system.
Exactly. Well, I got like hand issues now, so I just got to make sure I'm not on my phone.
OneSec is a lot better than Apple's like built-in sort of screen time because there's always a way to skip it. And you just like build a habit. It's like, oh, pop up, skip, and then this like at least forces you, it still lets you do the thing, but it like forces you to like pause for a few seconds. And that usually that initial dopamine craving that you get a chance to realize like, oh, I'm monkey brain right now. I can like not do this.
Yeah. Just like pressing it really quick.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, that wraps it up for Tooltips and for the episode. Thanks for coming on, Jason, and teaching us all about LLMs and how to use them and what all the acronyms mean. So thanks again for coming on.
Thanks, man. That was a blast. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. This has been really interesting, and you're doing a lot of cool work. Would love to see it as it develops.